e4. King's pawn opening, opening line. The king's pawn opening move is both popular and logical. It controls the center, opens lines for both the queen and the bishop, and usually leads to an open game in which tactics, rather than slow maneuvering, predominates. c6. Caro-Kann defense, opening line. The Caro-Kann defense may be compared to the Slav defense against the queen's pawn. It strives for defense of the strong point at d5 and development of the queen's bishop. Knight f3. King's Indian attack transposed, opening line. d5. King's Indian attack, opening line. d3. Out of opening book. Knight c3 would have been in the Caro-Kann defense, two knights variation, transposed, opening line. Protects white's pawn at e4. Queen c7. g3. Knight f6. Queen e2. d takes e4. Threatens white's knight at f3. d takes e4. Removes the threat on white's knight at f3. White wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. e5. Bishop g2 enables the short castle. Bishop e7 enables the short castle. Castle kingside. Castle kingside. b3. Bishop g4 pins white's knight at f3 and blocks white's pawn at g3. Knight b d2. Knight b d7. Bishop b2. Rook f e8. h3. Attacks black's bishop at g4. Bishop h5. Moves it to safety. Bishop h5. Moves it to a4. a5. Knight c4. Bishop c5. King h1. Bishop d4 partially pins white's bishop at b2. c3 frees white's bishop at b2 from the pin and threatens black's bishop at d4. Bishop c5 moves it to safety. Rook a d1. Bishop f8. Queen e3. Knight c5 attacks white's pawn at b3. Bishop a3. b6. g4 frees the pin on white's knight at f3 and threatens black's bishop at h5. Bishop g6 moves it to safety. Knight h4. Bishop takes e4. Bishop takes e4. Blocks black's pawn at e5. Knight f takes e4. Black wins a bishop and a pawn for a bishop. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. Knight f5 moves it off the edge. Knight f6. Knight c d6 attacks black's rook at e8. Rook e6 moves it to safety. Bishop takes c5 removes the threat on white's pawn at b3 and blocks black's pawn at c6. B takes c5. Black wins a bishop for a knight. Knight e4 blocks black's pawn at e5. Knight d5 attacks white's queen. Queen g3 moves it to safety. g6 threatens white's knight at f5. Rook d2. King h8. Rook g1. f6. Knight e3 moves it out of immediate danger. Knight f4. Rook g d1. Queen f7. g5. f5 attacks white's knight at e4. Knight f6 moves it out of immediate danger. Bishop e7. Rook d7 pins black's bishop. Knight e2 forks white's pawn at c3 and white's queen. Queen h4 moves it to safety. Knight takes c3 attacks white's rook at d1. Black wins a pawn. Rook 1 d3 moves it to safety and attacks black's knight. Knight e2 moves it to safety. Knight c4 blocks black's pawn at c5. Knight d4. Rook b7. e4 attacks white's rook at d3. Rook d1 moves it to safety. Queen g7. Queen f4 blocks black's pawn at f5. Rook f8. Slightly better is bishop takes f6. Thinking. The chess master recommends bishop takes knight. Your bishop captures knight, which attacks white's rook at b7. White responds with rook takes queen. Your bishop captures rook. White responds by moving queen to c7. You move your king to g8. White counters with queen to b6, which protects white's pawn at b3 and threatens your pawn at c5. You move your pawn to h6, which attacks white's pawn at g5. White responds with pawn takes pawn, which threatens your bishop and creates a passed pawn on h6. Your bishop takes pawn. White responds with knight takes pawn, which pins your pawn at c5 and creates a passed pawn on a4. You move your bishop to f8, which protects your pawn at c5. As a result of this line of play, white's mobility is greatly decreased. Additionally, the development of your pawns is improved, and white's pawn structure is somewhat weakened. Also, the pressure on your king is eliminated. rook f8. Slightly better is bishop takes f6. Knight e5 leads to bishop takes f6, rook takes g7, bishop takes e5, rook takes h7, check, king takes h7, queen c1, bishop d6, queen c3, rook a8, h4, rook e7, king g2, king g7, which wins a queen and a pawn for a rook and two knights. Better is knight d7, leading to rook g8, knight takes c5, bishop takes c5, rook takes g7, rook takes g7, knight takes a5, rook e8, queen c1, bishop a7, queen c3, rook d8, knight c4, which wins a queen and two pawns for a rook and a knight. Rook d6, yikes, leads to rook takes e7, rook d takes f6, rook takes g7, king takes g7, g takes f6, check, rook takes f6, queen c1, rook d6, queen takes c5, rook d5, queen e7, check, king h6, knight takes c6, knight takes c6, queen f8, check, king h5, rook takes d5, which wins a rook, two knights, and a pawn for a queen, two rooks, a bishop, and two pawns. Much better is bishop takes f6, leading to rook takes g7, bishop takes e5, rook takes h7, check, king takes h7, queen c1, bishop d6, queen c3, rook a8, h4, rook e7, king g2, king g7, which wins a rook and two knights for a queen and a pawn. This error should have lost the game for black, but white returned the favor with another mistake. White later resigned. Knight c4, yikes, leads to rook d8, rook f1, knight e6, queen h4, bishop takes f6, rook takes g7, bishop takes g7, knight takes a5, rook d3, rook c1, rook b8, which wins a queen and a pawn for a rook and a knight. Much better is rook takes e7, leading to rook d takes f6, rook takes g7, king takes g7, g takes f6, check, rook takes f6, queen c1, rook d6, queen takes c5, rook d5, queen e7, check, king h6, knight takes c6, knight takes c6, queen f8, check, king h5, rook takes d5, which wins a queen, two rooks, a bishop, and two pawns for a rook, two knights, and a pawn. White had a won game, but gave it away with this blooper. White later resigned. Rook d8 moves it to safety. Knight d7. Slightly better is rook f1. Thinking. The chess master recommends rook to f1. You move your rook to f1. Black counters with the knight to e6, which attacks your queen. You move your queen to h4, which moves it to safety. Black counters with bishop takes knight, which attacks your rook at b7. Your rook captures queen, which threatens to mate. Queen captures pawn at h7. Black counters with bishop takes rook. Your knight takes pawn, which threatens black's pawn at c6 and creates a passed pawn on a4. Black replies by moving rook to d3. You move your rook to c1. Black counters with rook to b8. As a result of this line of play, you win a queen and a pawn for a rook and a knight. Additionally, the development of your pawns is somewhat improved. Knight d7. Slightly better is rook f1. Bishop takes g5. Partially pins white's knight at d7, attacks white's queen, and isolates white's pawn at h3 and white's pawn at f2. Black wins a pawn. Queen d6. Moves it to safety. Rook f e8. Moves it to safety. Queen takes c5. Pins black's pawn at f5 and blocks black's pawn at c6. White wins a pawn. Knight f3 hangs the pawn at c6. Leads to queen takes a5, bishop f6, queen c7, queen h6, king g2, queen g5, check, queen g3, queen takes g3, check, king takes g3, bishop d4, knight c b6, king g7, which wins a queen for a queen and a pawn. Better is knight e2, leading to king g2, queen c3, knight e3, queen takes c5, knight takes c5, knight f4, check, king g3, knight d3, knight takes d3, e takes d3, knight c4, which wins a queen and a knight for a queen and a knight. King g2. Slightly better is queen takes a5. Analyzing. The chess master recommends queen captures pawn at a5. Your queen captures pawn at a5, which creates a passed pawn on a4. Black responds by moving the bishop to f6. You move your queen to c7, which threatens black's pawn at c6. Black counters with queen to h6, which threatens your pawn at h3. You move your king to g2, which removes the threat on your pawn at h3. Black answers with queen to g5, which removes the threat on black's pawn at c6 and black's bishop and checks your king. You move your queen to g3, which protects your king. Black counters with queen captures queen, which checks your king. Your king captures queen, which threatens black's bishop. Black replies by moving the bishop to d4, which moves it out of immediate jeopardy. You move your knight at c4 to b6. Black responds by moving the king to g7. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win a queen and a pawn for a queen. In addition, the mobility of black's pieces is greatly decreased. Also, your pawn structure is somewhat stronger. Finally, the pressure on black's king is somewhat increased. King g2. Slightly better is queen takes a5. Knight h4, check. protects black's pawn at c6, and black's pawn at a5 checks white's king and blocks white's pawn at h3. King f1 moves it out of check and forks black's pawn at c6 and black's pawn at a5. Rook e7. Slightly better is queen c3. Diagnosing. The chessmaster recommends queen to c3. You move your queen to c3, which removes the threat on your pawn at a5 and attacks white's pawn at h3. White responds by moving queen to d4, which protects white's pawn at h3 and forks your king and your queen. Your queen captures queen, which threatens checkmate. Queen takes rook, protects your king, and attacks white's rook at d1. White responds with rook captures queen. You move your knight to f3, which threatens white's rook at d4 and blocks white's pawn at f2. White counters with rook to d6, which moves it to safety and attacks your pawn at c6. You move your bishop to e7, which threatens white's rook at d6. White responds with rook takes pawn at c6. You move your bishop to b4, which protects your pawn at a5 and blocks white's pawn at b3. White responds by moving the king to g2. You move your knight to e1, which checks white's king. White counters by moving the king to g1, which moves it out of check. You move your knight to d3, which takes the knight away from the edge of the board. As a result of this line of play, white's mobility is greatly decreased. In addition, the development of your pawns is improved. Rook e7. Slightly better is queen c3. Queen takes c6. Yikes! Frees the pin on black's pawn at f5. Leads to queen c3, knight c e5, queen takes h3, check, king e2, knight g2, rook d6, queen h5, check, f3, e takes f3, check, queen takes f3, queen h1, queen c6, rook takes e5, check, king d3, rook e4, which wins 2 pawns for a knight and 2 pawns. Much better is queen takes a5, leading to rook e8, knight c e5, rook takes e5, queen takes d8, check, bishop takes d8, knight takes e5, queen takes b7, rook takes d8, check, king g7, rook d7, check, queen takes d7, knight takes d7, knight f3, knight b6, which wins a queen, 2 rooks, a bishop, and a pawn, for a queen, 2 rooks, and a knight. Queen c3 partially pins white's knight at c4, removes the threat on black's pawn at a5, and threatens white's pawn at h3. Knight c e5 attacks black's queen. Queen takes h3, check, checks white's king, and creates a passed pawn on h7. Black wins. King e2 moves it out of check and frees white's knight at d7 from the pin. Knight g2 moves it off the edge. queen c7. Yikes! Pins own knight at d7. Leads to queen h5, check. Knight g4, queen takes g4, check. King f1, knight e3, check. F takes e3, queen takes d1, check. King g2, queen d2, check. King f1, rook d takes d7, rook b8, check. King g7, queen g3, queen d1, check. Queen e1, queen takes e1, check. King takes e1, bishop takes e3, which wins a queen and a knight. For a queen, a rook, 2 knights, and a pawn. Much better is rook d6, leading to knight f4, check. King d1, queen f1, check. King c2, knight d3, knight takes d3, e takes d3, check. King c3, d2, rook takes d2, bishop takes d2, check. King b2, bishop c1, check. Queen takes c1, queen takes f2, check. King a3, rook e takes d7, which wins a bishop, a knight, and a pawn. For a rook, 2 knights, and a pawn. Knight f4, check. Yikes! Leads to king e1, queen h1, check. King d2, knight e6, check. King c2, queen takes d1, check. King takes d1, knight takes c7. King e2, rook d takes d7, knight takes d7, rook takes d7, b4, a takes b4. Rook b8, check. King g7, rook takes b4, which wins a queen, a rook, 2 knights, and a pawn. For a queen, a rook, and a pawn. Much better is queen h5, check, leading to knight g4, queen takes g4, check. King f1, knight e3, check. F takes e3, queen takes d1, check. King g2, queen d2, check. King f1, rook d takes d7, rook b8, check. King g7, queen g3, queen d1, check. Queen e1, queen takes e1, check. King takes e1, bishop takes e3, which wins a queen, a rook, 2 knights, and a pawn. For a queen and a knight. King e1 moves it out of check and forks black's rook at d8 and black's pawn at a5. Queen h1, check. Danger! Moves the queen into the corner. Leads to king d2, knight d5, check. King c2, rook d takes d7, queen takes d7, rook takes d7, rook takes d7, which wins a queen and a knight. For 2 rooks. Much better is rook e takes d7, leading to queen takes d7, rook takes d7, rook b8, check. King g7, rook takes d7, check. King f6, king d1, knight d5, rook f8, check. King takes e5, rook e8, check. King d4, king c2, which wins a queen and 2 knights. For 2 rooks. King d2. Forced move. Knight e6, check. Protects black's rook at d8, black's pawn at a5, and black's queen, and forks white's queen and white's king. King c2. Moves it out of check and forks black's pawn at a5 and black's queen. Queen takes d1, check. Protects black's pawn at a5 and checks white's king. King takes d1. attacks black's pawn at a5. Knight takes c7, protects black's pawn at a5. Rook takes c7, leads to rook takes e5, king c2, rook e7, b4, a takes b4, rook c4, rook e takes d7, rook takes b4, rook d2, check, king b3, rook 8 d3, check, king c4, rook c2, check, king b5, bishop d2, rook b1, rook d5, check, king b6, bishop a5, check, king b7, rook takes f2, which wins a knight and a pawn for 2 knights and 2 pawns. Better is king c2, leading to knight e6, king b1, knight d4, king a2, bishop f4, knight c4, rook d takes d7, rook takes d7, rook takes d7, knight takes a5, king g7, knight c4, king f6, which wins a rook and a pawn for a rook and a knight. Rook takes e5. Black wins a queen, a rook, and a knight for a queen and a knight. White resigns.